Hi, sexy people. I'm Dr. Tammy. Welcome to The Trouble with Sex. I have a really thought-provoking guest today. I'm really thrilled that Dr. Lee Phillips could join us. Dr. Lee Phillips is a licensed clinical social worker, a certified sex therapist, and a certified sex and couples therapist. He specializes in working with individuals and couples on sex after chronic illness. He writes for Psychology Today, and his first book is in the works called Sex and Love When You're in Pain. He's also the host of the Sex and Chronic Illness podcast, which features stories from individuals, couples, and other experts in the field on overcoming shame and the sexual limitations caused by disability and illness. And I'm also going to talk to Dr. Lee today about the stigma of disability and sex and what he thinks are the best ways to work through illness and disability and chronic pain when you're in a relationship and also when you're on your own. And today we're in this really strange time of getting through a pandemic. So we're going to address all of those things with Dr. Lee. Help us spread the love. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe and take a minute to give us 5 stars or write a great review on Apple Podcasts. Not only do we love to hear your feedback, your support really makes a difference. It's going to help other people who are looking for advice about their relationships and sexual wellness. We have lots of amazing guests coming up, so subscribe so you don't miss a thing. We love and appreciate all of you, and thank you so much for your continued support. Dr. Lee, tell us, why are you so helpful to people with chronic illness and sex, and what made you decide to go into this area?
Well, there's a lot of reasons. And, the thing is that it provides me doing this type of work as a therapist. It provides people a safe place to talk, to be able to have a space. I always call therapy the safe container to be able to talk. And so that's one reason. A lot of it's professional and it's also personal. A lot of it is personal in regards of, in 2012, I was diagnosed with Lyme's disease myself, and I struggled with that. And I was in a relationship at the time, and the relationship crumbled from it. And then I started working as a psychotherapist, working in chronic pain management. Then I moved to DC and I attended a Building Your Private Practice workshop that was led by Gail Gutman. And she said, "What type of work do you do as a therapist?" And I said, "I focus on chronic illness and disability and chronic pain." And she said, "Well, have you ever thought about becoming a sex therapist? Because there's so many people that could really use your help in reclaiming their sexuality." And I thought that was really cool. And then I started the ASEX process, and then it just kind of took off. And I was able to combine the sex therapy and the chronic pain management that I do and integrate that in with sex and couples therapy. And it's just been great. So those are the reasons why I do this work.
Yeah, it's so important, right? Because I think you're right. I think illness and chronic pain and disability, they affect our relationships, and particularly our most intimate personal relationships. I can totally relate to the Lyme disease thing because I lived in Connecticut for a long time, and everyone in Connecticut has Lyme disease. And and now I live in LA, and I just recently was looking into playing tennis again. And I had this flashback, like the reason I stopped playing tennis is because my joints all seized up from my Lyme disease. Like I literally couldn't lift my racket anymore. I couldn't swing the racket. My shoulders locked up my elbows. And, I always felt like I had the flu, and it was awful. Like that Lyme disease, man, it's killers.
It is. It's a lot of joint pain, malaise. And one of the things that people really talk about with chronic illness is just the energy levels. Mm-hmm. That's one of the biggest things that shows up in my office. It's like, I have no energy. And then you think about sex, and it's like the energy for sex. So we work where's your sexual peak at, right? So we do a lot of that work in session too. But yeah, it really does have a big effect on the relationships, especially when it comes to having a healthy partner, and then there's a partner that's ill, and then having to really be in that type of relationship where there's this new normal and someone's life has completely changed.
What do you mean sexual peak? Can you tell us more about that?
Sexual peak, is it in the morning when you're more aroused? Are you an afternoon sex person? Are you a sex person in the evening? So one of the things that I do with my couples or just people in session is really talk about, where's that peak at? Do you have a place where you feel more aroused? Maybe someone before they became sick, it was in the evening, but in the morning, now they have more energy. So it's like, okay, now maybe I can have morning sex. I find that a lot with people that have multiple sclerosis, but that's what I mean by sexual peak. Yeah.
So it's like your sexual peak time, your sexual energy when it
Right.
peaks. Yeah. I mean,
Mhm.
yeah, I remember Friday nights used to be good. Now, by the time I hit that finish line, I'm like, yeah, no, I just want to
Friday,
go to bed
yeah,
early.
no,
Totally true.
totally. Friday night is date night in this house, and it's going to have to be a date night, but I know by 9 o'clock, we're both going to crash.
Totally. I'd be lucky if I could make it till 9. It's so true. So, I mean, there's a wide range of things here. There is exhaustion, and then there's pain, and then there's actual like limited physical mobility, right? Like, so there's only so many things you can do if you're in a wheelchair that, can be a really hard transition to make.
Right. Yeah. But you can get very creative in a wheelchair as well. And that's kind of like my mantra to everyone. It's get curious about your partner and get creative with your sex. Like when the curiosity starts to go down, that's where we tend to see sexless relationships. And I always say, whether you've been together 1 year, 5 years, 10, 20, 30, and so on, it's so critical to get curious and to know, okay, there's this new normal, there's this life-changing event. What can we do now to get curious? And sometimes by talking to a sex therapist, that can be very helpful.
Yeah, I think that's true in all relationships, is that when we stop being curious, we say like, oh, I know what my partner likes. I know they're not into that. They would never do this. And they don't like it that way. Then you're just, digging your grave, because that kills off your sex drive for each other and your sexual attraction. So it makes total sense when you're saying, to continue to be creative, you have to have a little bit of curiosity, not just about your partner, but about yourself. Like, how can I sort of dig in and figure out like what would be interesting here? How could I push my own edge?
Right. So one of the things that we talk about is solo sex. How do you want to be touched? What's off limits? What feels good? And a lot of times that's doing that yourself. And then by getting creative, you're inviting your partner into that space.
So how do you do that? Like, how do you tell your partner, okay, look, it used to feel good when you did this, but now it hurts. So can you please do that?
Well, I think it comes from a place of empathy. And a lot of times when people come into therapy, they look at things like a problem. So instead of looking at it like a problem, let's look at it like an opportunity. And so sometimes when we reframe that, and I think sometimes when people come into your office and you say, look, I have experience in this, I'm a sex and couples therapist, or like, oh, okay, so you address the sex part. And people love that. It's like you can see the anxiety and the walls just kind of come down. And it's like, okay, I can be vulnerable. And I think, sex at its heart, it's about communication. It's about talking about it. And so I think that really starts the process. There's this idea that, you have to have this emotional connection to have great sex, but sometimes you really just need the great sex and the relationship can fix itself.
Oh, you have learned so well from me, Lee.
I do think that's in getting the sex you want.
Oh, grasshopper, you've come so far.
But that's what it's about. It's about, hey, this curiosity of how can we get creative with our sex? We may not be able to have penetrative sex, but hey, you can touch me here. There's so many erogenous zones throughout the body. The skin's amazing. Sometimes, Dr. Tammy, we got to get away from the genitals because it's not all about the genitals.
All right, you preach that, Dr. Lee. I think that is it. That's so true. You got to get away from those genitals. I think what Dr. Lee is saying is there's a lot of pleasure to be had. There's a lot of pleasure zones in your body. You can touch a lot of places in your skin. And so, that widens the opportunities, particularly if you have some disabilities or if you have chronic pain or if you're avoidant for whatever reason.
Exactly. And I think, I've had a lot of clients before that have been wheelchair users. Mm-hmm. And so limited sensation. So where on your body do you feel it? I'll never forget, I took a SAR one time.
Just sexual attitude reassessment course.
Yes, which was amazing. And there was this guy that ended up falling off of a building and he was paralyzed from the waist down. And he went to sex surrogate and she was doing a lot of things with him and experimenting. And she actually massaged his thumb as if it were his penis And he had this like orgasmic reaction to it, like had like a body orgasm. He said it felt so good. And it was like some of the best pleasure that he had felt since before the accident. That's what I think people have to do.
Totally.
It's this creativity and really getting in touch with your body. But in order to get there, we have to get to a place of acceptance. And a lot of times there's a grief process that has to happen first before we can even get to the sexual piece.
Oh, totally. I mean, just in smaller ways, sex and aging, like as your body ages, you go through menopause, or if you're in a male body, you get older, it doesn't quite function in the way it used to. That's just a small example of how you have to grieve the sexual function that you may have had when you were younger. And once you do that, you can learn to be curious and find out what are the newer or more expanded ways that you might experience pleasure. Yeah,
right.
That makes total sense.
Yeah, and how to get more creative with it, but also really accepting yourself for where you're at with it. And there's different stages of a chronic illness. And we find that is the integration stage, where you find out that your chronic illness or disability, it is a part of you. It doesn't define you. It's a piece that's there, but you have all of these other things about you where you can receive pleasure. I had a client one time, and she said, my multiple sclerosis is not me. I am not my illness. And I thought that was incredible. I was like, wow. And it was during a chronic group management session that I was facilitating. And it was great just to hear that.
I really like that. I like that this is just a part of you. It's something that's happening to you, not who you are. It doesn't define you as a person.
Right.
Do you think that there's a difference between how men experience it and how women experience it, or how people who were gay versus straight or trans or on the spectrum? Like, do you think that there's differences in how people are experiencing their illness or disability and then their sexuality?
That's a really good question. I think so. When I have facilitated chronic pain management groups, they've always turned out to be women's groups, which was very interesting. Oh. And like half the women in there have had everything from lupus to fibromyalgia. And what was fascinating is that half the women in the group also experienced sexual trauma when they were younger. Because I think, going back, like when you're looking at books like When the Body Keeps Score, holding that pain inside of you for so long, being traumatized and the muscles tensing up. That's one of the biggest things with fibro is problems with the muscles. I've had quite a few men in therapy with chronic illness and chronic pain, and it's affected them as well, especially if they're having the sexual dysfunction, with erection or delayed ejaculation or retrograde ejaculation, where there's even an absence of being able to reach orgasm. That causes a lot of depression, of course. And so being able to work with those feelings. And I think that's like with any man that I have in therapy, it's like this shame and disappointment, like, oh my gosh, I've been able to solve everything else in my life, and now I have erectile issues.
So the real shame around performance stuff and not
performance. That's the big piece. And I see that more with cisgender heterosexual men than I do with gay men.
Oh, really? You would think all men with penises would feel that way.
All men with penises, but a lot of the gay men that I've worked with, they're like, oh, okay, my penis doesn't work. Time to use my mouth and do other things.
Wow, that's cool. That's very creative.
So the whole goal is this creativity piece that comes with it.
I'd love to ask you, Dr. Lee, what do you think is the biggest trouble with sex today?
Wow, that's a loaded question. The biggest trouble with sex today? Well, I have to be honest with you. I think part of it is COVID-19.
Oh, interesting.
And the reason why I say that is because a lot of the people that I work with, I've noticed that they're having less sex.
Yeah.
A lot of the couples that I've had in therapy with the pandemic, they're with each other all day. They're in the home. There's nothing separating it. So I've actually seen a decrease in sex. And I've seen this among my gay clients and also my straight clients.
Yeah.
Like with everyone. And it's like, we're just tired. There's like this ongoing fatigue.
Yeah. It's like this malaise, pandemic fatigue.
But what's interesting is that they're masturbating.
How do they find time and separation to masturbate?
In the bathroom.
In the shower.
Shower. And it's because they're not necessarily aroused. It's because it takes the stress away, which masturbation is also great for chronic pain.
Oh, well, that makes sense because of the release of the hormones and the brain chemicals and stuff. So is that something you recommend for people if they're in chronic pain?
I do recommend it. But what's funny is that, a lot of my clients already come in and they talk about that, especially with relief for migraine headaches. They will talk about, masturbating like in the morning gives me that energy. And then at night when I want to relax, I will masturbate. And that also helps. So it's always great to hear that. And plus you're getting creative and you're exploring your body even more.
So if you're working with a couple, would you recommend that they integrate their masturbation into their sex life with their partner?
Absolutely, because one partner may masturbate a certain way that really feels comfortable to them and that they like and that their partner doesn't know about. So that's that piece of closing that loophole of getting curious.
Mm-hmm.
I've been masturbating. This is how I've been doing it. I want to show you, and I always find that to be quite fascinating. But then again, I've had people in therapy where that's my time to masturbate. I don't want to share that with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they need some privacy. Right, absolutely. Especially if you're in a small apartment all day long and you can't get away from each other. And
Let me tell you something. I was in a studio apartment in DuPont for the half of COVID. And it was tough, but we made it.
You made it. Well, you also talked about moving the whole time, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah. Well, it was at the point where we just got sick of it and we were like, we got to go. We got to do something. And so we came out to Northern Virginia into a bigger place and it's been wonderful.
Oh, good. You have some space to masturbate.
I do. I have space to masturbate. I have my little office. Good. I have my little privacy. Good. He has his privacy.
Good for you. Good for you. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. If you've ever been interested in becoming a sex therapist or a sexuality counselor, find out more at integrativesextherapyinstitute.com or istitraining.com, I-S-T-I training.com. ISTI trains therapists to be the best sex and couples therapists that they can be. Classes are easy. They're online. You can download information anytime and apply today. That's istitraining.com, Integrative Sex Therapy Institute. I'm wondering if there is like a certain theme that you notice among all of your clients that have a disability or an illness or chronic pain that shows up in their sex life.
Emotionally, it's depression.
Oh,
that's the biggest thing that I deal with. There's this sadness, this depression because my body has changed or I can't do the things that I used to work with before. That's the grief aspect. Physically, it's the energy level. It's not the illness itself. It's the psychological factors that come with it. But there's this fatigue that tends to occur with every type of illness that comes into my office, whether it's a neurological disease or it's an autoimmune, if it's like recovering remission from cancer, there's this fatigue that's currently happening. And so we have to really work with how do we get the energy levels up for sex? What can we do? Those peaks I was talking about, are there ways to get creative with your partner? Creativity includes different positions, getting creative by dressing up, having that sexy date night, doing those different things that you can do, and putting sex on the calendar.
Yeah, I'm all for that. I'm all for the sex date on the calendar. I think that's a great idea.
Oh, I know you are.
That sounded really dirty, Lee. I have taught Lee many things. He's been in my program. It's not personal. I'm thinking about like pain and depression as being that commonality. I bet you see a lot of people who get addicted to pain medication. And how does substance abuse play a role here in relationships?
That's a great question, too. A lot of times, what I try to do in my practice, since I am also a substance abuse counselor, is that they are already in some type of recovery or in a relapse prevention. I use a lot of harm reduction.
Okay.
But if there's a serious use of something, I usually don't see them. They need to go into another program. But if they're in recovery and they're working a program, then we can work with something. Because what happens is after someone stops using, emotionally, it stunts them. So it's learning how to grow again and learning how to be sexual.
Yeah.
So that's the other piece that we have to do too. So that's how that plays into that.
That makes a lot of sense. Dr. Lee, I want to ask you a question from a listener who says, I was diagnosed with lupus a few years ago and feel like my body has betrayed me, let alone never feel like having sex. This is really taking a toll on my relationship. What can I do or we do to get started and heal our disconnect to become physical again? It's an overwhelming idea to me, but I want to try. And just the caveat here for me with this listener, why I think this question is so important, is I have family members who have lupus. My mother died of lupus. Like I watched the, you know, the degenerative effects of lupus and how devastating that can be on relationships. So I really want to thank this listener so much for sending in this question. And my love goes out to you and to your partner. So, Dr. Lee, what do you think?
Well, I think that is an excellent question. The one thing that I really like what I heard there is that there's motivation. There is a want. It's like, I want to do this. And so that is one thing that I would really recommend. Why do you want to do this? What type of desire is there? Is there anything there, right? Are there things that you find that can be arousing? And get curious about that. Talk about that with your partner. If they are really interested, I would recommend going to a sex and couples therapist so they have a place to bring it up. Sometimes that space is needed. There's a lot of like depression there, probably as well, and a lot of shame, feeling broken. So I think a lot of times coming to grips with the illness, I would be curious where this listener is at. Sometimes people come in and they're like, look, I've already grieved my illness. I'm ready to have sex.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's great because that motivation is really there. So then really think about what are the things that turn you on? What are the things how you can get aroused? What are the parts of your body where you feel pleasure? So again, there's this curiosity piece. And I would be curious about how the other partner feels too. What's going on there? Sometimes the other partner starts to feel a lot of anxiety as well. If I do go into sex, am I going to hurt my partner? Right? Is it going to make, are they going to feel great? Right? So even the healthy partner feels like they've got to have some type of performance that goes into this. But we know we need to get out of performative-based sex and focus on the pleasure-based sex. What just feels good? And I would want them to know about that, right?
I love that, to get out of the performance and into the pleasure, like what brings you pleasure. I also like this idea of what parts of your body bring you pleasure that aren't necessarily, your genitals, like to ask directly, like if we're not talking about your penis or your scrotum, like what parts of your body feel good when I touch them? Or if we're not talking about your vulva or your breasts or your vagina, like what parts when I touch them feel good? And to even like give it a rating on 1 to 5, like what does this feel like when I touch you here? When I touch the inside of your arm, is it what feels good? When I touch the inside of your thigh, what does that feel like? To really help people express those ranges of pleasure that they might not even know. Like who knows what it feels like if someone touches your underarm.
Right, because if this onset came on later, so in the past they were a sexual being, they had probably, had sex a different way.
Right.
So what's it like to have sex now?
Right.
You may not be able to have penetrative sex. It may be painful to you. So what else can you do? If you're having neck pain, is there a certain way you can shift your body? There's a lot of great resources out there. Liberator is great. And if you go to my website, drleephillips.com, I have that on there. There's like furniture wedges that people can use when things don't feel so good.
That's a good point. Yeah.
That's another thing too, because with chronic illness, you also have the chronic pain that comes with it. So when do you feel your pain more? When do you feel pain less? Also, are you working on the psychological symptoms that come with chronic pain? Because research shows us that when you can decrease the depression and anxiety, you can manage your pain better. When there's an increase in depression and anxiety, it's going to hit your pain signals throughout your body. That's why the research is showing that one of the best treatments for chronic pain is psychotherapy.
That's really good to know. So one of the best treatments for chronic pain is psychotherapy. So you're really working on the cognitive piece, like with the story you make up about the pain. Like you could live a long, happy life with lupus and, and be totally fine. But if the story you make up is, oh my God, I have pain, my partner's never going to want to be with me, this is never going to work, I'm not going to be the same person, it's easy to go down the rabbit hole. That makes total sense.
Exactly. So there's this negative thought process that goes with it too, right? So we know that there's a content issue there. But a lot of times I find that when someone comes into sex therapy, and if they have a healthy relationship, they may not be in sex therapy for long. They can use cognitive therapy techniques and sensate focus. But if there's more ruptures there, and there's more of an emotional damage going on, such as shame and the other dysfunctions that are going on in the relationship, we have to go underneath that and dig that up and find out, what can we do with that? It's like picking the Band-Aid off, but sometimes that needs to happen.
Totally.
I look at therapy, it's like a puzzle. You lay it out on the table. Where do the pieces need to go?
Totally.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the fear that the partner has a little bit more, like the fear of rejection or hopelessness that they might be feeling? Because, they don't want to hurt their partner, or, they might feel the loss as well, and they have to grieve that. And maybe what they could do to help their partner, but also to stay positive themselves.
Well, one of the things that I always recommend is some type of support group. Sometimes being with other people and find out how they've coped with it can be super helpful. And sometimes your local hospitals will have caregiver support groups or other support groups. I also recommend individual therapy, so that partner may have a healthy space to be able to talk about it. Maybe they're not able to talk about certain things. And also work on their reframing around the rejection. Maybe they fear this, but they haven't tried yet. Or there is this constant fear of harming their partner. But there's also anger too, and there's a grief there. Here we have this great sex life, and now you have the onset of this illness or disability, and now I can't even touch you. So we start to see resentment there too that comes into play. 75% of marriages break up due to chronic pain and chronic illness.
Wow, I didn't know that.
That's why therapy is that place to be able to talk about it. And that's why the work is so critical. But once you have that space where you can share, and as a sex and relationship therapist, I use a lot of imago therapy to really reduce the reactivity in the room. And then they can really get to a place where they can feel heard. It's so amazing what can unravel in a therapy room and how things can come out that are never spoken about.
Yeah, it's really interesting how you can help people just by communicating. You can help people. Do you ever suggest that people open their relationship when they're in a chronic pain situation or illness?
It's happened, especially if there's a partner where they feel nothing and it's like, I don't desire this, but I know you really want it.
Mm-hmm.
And so when that happens, we talk about, well, what are those boundaries and rules that need to come up, right? Boundaries are a little bit more flexible, but then we have these rules that people have. I don't want to hear about it. If you go out and you have sex with someone, I don't want to hear about it. Or I do want to know about it, but I don't need all the details. I just want to know that you did it. And if that's what you want to do, that's fine. I have worked with folks that have also been polyamorous, where they've had someone come into their relationship and be in a triad or a quad or something like that, where they've invited other people in. And that partner that wants sex, they're able to get the emotional and sexual piece from someone else, but they're also able to still get that emotional, loving, and nurturing piece, which I think is fascinating. And I think it helps the relationship. That's not every couple that comes in, but there's a few. Or they use BDSM to help cope with their chronic pain, which is so fascinating, which is starting to come out in the research now.
That's really fascinating.
Yeah.
So I just want to go back for a minute because we had a question from a listener about what is imago. Can you explain that?
So imago relationship therapy is a type of therapy that was developed by Harville Hendrix. He was a psychologist. And basically the premise of it is that we have these images in our life, and we get messages from so many people, parents, teachers, peers. And so what happens is there's this unconscious part where we unconsciously pick a partner based on the positive and negative characteristics of our caretakers. And there's this unconscious part. What we find is, and that's our mirror, that's our image. But I find that, people want to have someone like their family, or they don't want anyone like their family. And then they find out they don't want that, but then they end up, it's like, oh, wow, she is like my mother, or he is like my father. I mean, my husband is so much like my dad.
Oh, God.
But it's wonderful because he's so genuine, and he's got this teddy bear thing to him. And my dad was like that. So this niceness and kindness. But then there's this oh, Dr. Lee, you put your shoes over here. They go in the closet. I'm like, damn.
So he's got positive and negative traits of your father.
The positive and negative traits, they're there, right? And so that's what I mean by that. And then, of course, when we look at the relationship in the space, we have these coping adaptations where one partner is definitely usually this maximizer, which we call the hailstorm, or they can be a tiger. And then the other partner is this minimizer where they go into their shell. And I find that happens a lot. And so the goal is to really work with that energy. And that's one of the things that we do as therapists, is to identify those energies and how they can work in their dance to where they can come to a healthier place. Couples always say, and this is important with chronic pain, we have to be on the same page. Well, that's great and all, but that doesn't always happen. How are you different?
Right.
And how can you respect your differences, right? I think that's really powerful.
Before we run out of time, I really want to go back to the BDSM thing because I find that fascinating that people who are in chronic pain would actually look for bondage, domination, sadomasochism, to where there might be some desire for pain and pleasure mixed together as a way to work through pain or illness or discomfort. So could you just say a little bit more about that? We could spend a whole episode just on that, but I really want to hear more about what you think about that.
Well, it focuses on the good pain versus the bad pain. And it's a way to distract. But, one of the things that happens in a scene is the
scene
focus.
is in BDSM where people negotiate what they want to happen and they act out a fantasy.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it happens before the scene, and it's all consensual, of course. And there's this intense focus on concentration in the present moment, where a lot of times when we're wrapped up in our pain cycle, we're all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're in a scene, whether it's rope play or it's flogging or whatever you're using, there's this concentration that happens. And it takes away from, it's almost like a concentration, but it's also a distractibility from your pain. There's this sense of identity and orientation. Everyone gets wrapped up into their identity of being in pain, but why now you can get wrapped up in your identity of being a dom or a sub.
A dominant or submissive.
Or submissive, right? And there's this sense of personal control with the situation. You are in control, even though you may be a submissive, you are still in control of what's happening. And your dominant or your dom or top or whatever you want to call it, master is definitely checking in with you.
Mm-hmm. And you have control because you have a safe word, so you can stop it whenever you want.
Right. And so when you have pain, chronic pain or your illness, you don't always have that.
That's true. You don't have control over it. Right.
Yeah, you don't have control. And there's this idea of merging into action and awareness in the moment, which I think is really powerful. So when I have clients that are interested in this, I love it. I think it's fascinating. And I think it's a great way to express your sexual needs, to also get creative, and to just do something different.
And be curious about what it would be like to be a little bit more in control and to be in control of the beginning, the middle, of the end of a really intense, high sensation experience that maybe you don't have in your own illness or your pain. So that makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah.
Yeah, I just got invited to be a story consultant on a series that's going to be happening on multiple sclerosis and burlesque.
Interesting.
Which I'm really excited about, being a burlesque person, but having the illness and using the burlesque to be able to share and to express your sexuality. I can't wait.
Oh, that sounds fascinating.
Yeah.
We'll have to have you back after that show.
Yeah, totally. Yeah,
I
absolutely.
want to hear more about that. Well, listen, Dr. Lee, this has been really interesting. I'm really fascinated by the work that you're doing with sex and love when you're in pain. So tell us how people can find you and where they can stay in touch with you to hear more about your work.
You can always reach out to me at my website, which is drleephillips.com, on Instagram at Dr. Lee Phillips, Facebook at Dr. Lee Phillips, and Twitter at Dr. Lee Phillips.
And for all of my sexy listeners, thank you so much for joining me with Dr. Lee Phillips. Stay sexy. Until next time. To find out more, go to thetroublewithsex.com or email me at drtammy@thetroublewithsex.com. Join our mailing list, follow us on social media, sign up for our newsletter, or send me a question. The Trouble with Sex is produced by Brandy Savitt and Jane Applegate. Our audio is by Flavor Lab, New York City. This episode was recorded on location by Bruce Hirschfield and mixed by Yulia Skubish and Eric Stern, with music by Bruce Hirschfield.